The Black Knight, Chapter 1, The Chosen Few. The story begins with a simple drawing of 4 names. This heavily publicized contest was meant to determine those privileged enough to attend the grand opening of the Black Knight Rollercoaster at Two Gardens Theme Park. The owner of the park, Alan Seasons, had decided to close Two Gardens for one day and invite a total of 8 guests through the gate, thus offering them reign over the entire park and the first chance to ride the unique thrill ride. Mr. Seasons chose 4 names randomly and asked each participant to invite a friend along. There were 8 in all, enough to fill one roller coaster car. The day of the grand opening, 8 anxious guests stood by the closed iron gate into Two Gardens. Here stood Ryan and his girlfriend Karen, Cody and his friend Jeremy, Brock and his partner Kyle, and Nash and his teenage son Gary. Beyond the gate, the Black Knight roller coaster stood 105 stories at its highest peak, a coaster to revolutionize them all. The Black Knight had 10 upside-down loops and 5 90-degree freefalls, and it accelerated from 0 to 85 miles per hour in 2 seconds. It was supposed to be the fastest roller coaster in America, and taking up 500 square feet and all in almost 2 miles of track, it proved to be one of the largest coasters as well, complete with barrel rolls, sharp turns, and an underground tunnel equipped with pyrotechnics. "Welcome, friends," Mr. Seasons proclaimed at the gates. He then led the group through a towering awning inscribed with the name Black Knight. A 50-story sculpture greeted the newcomers beside the expansive helix of track, clad in black armor and a pointed helmet. Its arms were held out, and its sword, which was bigger than any of them, was riveted to its belt. The Black Knight met them with open arms. "I never expected it to be this big, that's what she said," Karen added before Ryan could jump in. Ryan laughed and closed his mouth. "Check this out, Jeremy," Cody said excitedly, practically jumping up and down. At 15 years old, Cody had a cleanly buzzed head and a dirty tank top, and Jeremy had shaggy blonde hair and a ruffled sweatshirt with the Led Zeppelin insignia. Jeremy shook in his oversized clothing, but not in excitement like his friend. This hadn't been his idea at all. He preferred the rides that spun you around in circles, not those that dropped you through the air. Cody was the lucky ticket winner and Jeremy was just along for the ride, and for the promise of funnel cakes. "Come, it's waiting for you," Mr. Seasons shouted as he moved toward the platform. He was a heavy-set man, with little to no hair on his head, and he wore a long leather trench coat and high-top military boots. All 8 guests moved down the concrete path and up a few steps onto the platform. After some friendly deliberation, they each chose their seats 2 in a row and snapped their safety belts across their lap. Then they pulled the padded chest guards down onto their shoulders. Ryan took Karen's hand, which was noticeably shaking. She gave him a soft smile, but quickly lost it when she glanced at the track in front of them. Ryan and Karen had chosen seats at the very front of the car against her better wishes. The teenagers didn't even want the front seats, which spoke volumes that Ryan couldn't see, but Karen understood all too well. The boys, Cody and Jeremy, chose the second row behind them, where they proceeded to cling to the handles on their chest guards in their building anticipation. Behind them sat Brock and Kyle. They were in their late 20s, Brock staring into the distance absently, while Kyle chatted casually about his job, although he spoke more to himself than anyone else. In the back row, Nash and his 13-year-old Gary sat together, half excited, yet both trembling. Nash nudged his son with an elbow, and they exchanged a smile. "I know this is always the worst part," Gary admitted after a gulp of fresh air. Nash raised his eyebrows as he was known to do when trying to get Gary to smile, and it usually worked. "I remember you being so excited this morning," Nash said. "I know, but once you get here and actually have to sit here, it's terrifying," Gary explained. Nash squirmed around uncomfortably in his plastic seat and leaned back his head. The bald spot on the back of his head burned against the headrest behind him, which had roasted all day in the sun. "Ready, riders?" Mr. Seasons cried. "Everyone nice and secure?" He stood on the edge of the platform, his open palm set above the control panel. Ryan glanced ahead of him at the track's progressive angle. After climbing to the first peak, some 200 feet in the air, they would plummet dramatically into the underground tunnel for about 4 seconds. Then they would climb back up at another sharp angle, spinning through a few barrel rolls before mounting the first upside-down loop. Ryan gulped, squeezing Karen's hand, and she could only squeeze back. I'm sure after this is over, we'll want to jump back on for another ride, Ryan assured his girlfriend. Mr. Seasons wished them all a great ride, saluting them with 2 pudgy fingers. Then his other hand slammed down on the control panel and the Black Knight trembled. In a rush of cool air, the car rocketed away from the platform with a terrific screech of metal. In an instant the car was over the first peak and free-falling into the tunnel below. Inside the cool passage, bright lights and spiraling visuals dazzled the eyes as the passengers propelled through the darkness. Then the car came to a jarring halt, launching all 8 riders into their chest guards. The light show immediately blinked out, leaving them in an empty void of recirculated air. "What the?" Kyle cried from somewhere in the dark. Gary started to sob and Jeremy babbled crazily about a crash. Then they heard someone scream outside of the tunnel, and silence quickly followed. Not even Gary was crying in the back. Then Alan Season screamed again, this time in strangled anguish, before muffling into nothing. They heard the crack of a gunshot and Karen cried out with surprise. A cold silence stole over them as they trembled in their seats, too frightened to speak. Ryan searched for Karen's hand in the dark and they found each other somewhere in the middle, sweaty fingers intertwining. She sobbed quietly while Ryan gasped for air. Then the car lurched forward again, excelling from 0 to 80 miles per hour. As soon as they emerged from the tunnel, they were greeted with harsh sunlight. The Black Knight came to another wrenching stop, Ryan's head striking the hard padding of his chest guard. Stars exploded in front of his eyes as he looked around. They were now stuck at a 45-degree angle directed straight down. Ryan followed the track with his eyes and saw they were at the verge of the first upside-down loop. "Ryan!" Karen screamed. "Look!" In stunned silence, Ryan realized she was pointing at the Black Knight statue, and he knew at once what he was looking at. There, hanging from one of the sculpture's outstretched hands, dangled the body of Alan Seasons, swaying back and forth from a cable. The cable was wrapped around his throat, drawing blood. The other end of the cable ended at a gnarled hook, wedged between the statue's curled fingers. Ribbons of blood trickled from his revealed entrails. His head rested on his shoulder, his face pulled back in a pained grimace. Mr. Seasons was barely off the ground, the steel toes of his boots just scratching with the gravel below him. Just above his nose, like a third eye crying tears of blood, someone had shot him. Everyone in the car screamed. The Black Knight. Chapter 2. Nash and Gary. It was close to noon, and the coasters stood silent as a twisted piece of metal in the sky. The riders spent the next 2 hours burning out their voices screaming for help, but it was agreed that they should save their energy and think of a solution. So they sat in silence for a short period before Gary gave in to another fit of quiet sobs. "Help! Somebody please help us!" Gary screamed into the afternoon air. "Where are the police?" "Cut it out, kid," Kyle growled in front of him. Although Gary hadn't even heard Kyle's grumblings, Brock kicked him in the leg. "This day of fun is from 10 a.m. to 11 p.m., so if the police realize we're missing, and that's if, it'll be well after midnight," Kyle continued. He craned his neck to look at the ground, over 100 stories beneath them. "We don't have that kind of time," Brock shot back. He yelled and kicked the seat in front of him. Cody jumped and tried to give the man an ugly look, but the chest guard wouldn't allow it. "Sorry, kid," he said. "There's just no way we can last up here with a murderer down there, somewhere." At the front of the car, Karen flinched and gave Ryan a distressed look. He lost focus of her face and had to close his eyes. After drying out in the sun for so long and so high in the air, he felt dehydration settling in. Gary started to cry again. "Gare, please, try not to think about it so much," Nash soothed next to him. He shook his son's hand up and down. "Come on, I'm sure whoever's down there, whoever did this, is long gone." "That's a laugh," Kyle cracked. He was talking to a person sitting directly behind him, so he turned his head to the side. This time, Nash heard him. "Hey, you want to shut your mouth?" Nash spat. This time he kicked the seat in front of him, but it was Brock's seat. Anyway, Kyle got the message. "You're not making things any better back here." "Why would the guy leave? We're trapped like rats up here," Kyle said. "It's everything a sick lunatic like him dreams of." "Shut the hell up, Kyle," Brock cried. "All I'm saying is, I hear what you're saying." Nash cut himself short when he noticed the grave expression on his son's face. Fighting wasn't helping either. "Dad, I don't want to die," Gary whispered. Nash's heart sank. "Son, don't listen to him, a loud squeak interrupted Nash's statement, and he suddenly raised his arms above his head in surprise. Nash and Gary's chest guards had released from their bodies, but only theirs. Gary and Nash stared down at their freedom in disbelief and didn't know what to do. "What was that?" Kyle demanded. He tried to crane his neck to see. "Our chest guards," Nash said distantly. "They just came up." "Then get the hell out of here," Ryan called from the front. "What are you waiting for?" "How?" Gary asked. He unbuckled his seatbelt on his own with trembling fingers. Ryan turned his head as far as it would go until he was practically dangling out of the car, and he could see a maintenance staircase welded to the track, complete with a platform and gate. "The staircase," Ryan yelled back. "Take it down to the controls, but you'll have to walk on the track." "We'll be killed if we try to balance on that thing," Nash said. "Those steps are at least 100 yards. Their yells were interrupted by a loud screech, and, turning toward the noise, they both saw the danger at the same moment. A dark figure had just mounted the first step on the maintenance stairs. "Shit!" Ryan yelled out. Gary yelped, standing up to cling to his father. "What the hell do we do?" Nash cried. He watched the man reach the top of the staircase. Ryan did not speak from the front. The man stopped at the top, pausing in front of the gate. Nash could see the stranger wore a black duster jacket and a bright and clean yellow scarf wrapped around his neck, which covered a good section of his face. A dark stocking cap was pulled down over his eyes, tendrils of black hair curling around the edges. "Don't worry, I'm the police. We've apprehended the man who—" The man turned to look at the statue and the puppet still dangling from its string. "He's not a threat anymore. I've come to get you down from here." Then he held up some kind of wallet above his head. "What's going on?" Jeremy asked Cody, but his friend had buried his face in his oversized sleeves, praying under his breath. Brock twisted violently in his seat to catch sight of the newcomer. "Tell me what's fucking happening," he yelled. A glint of light reflected off the wallet, and Nash realized it was a badge. "Please, you have to trust me," the man said. "I'll meet you halfway and help you to the stairs." Nash glanced hopelessly at the length of track between them. It progressed slowly upward at a slippery angle. "Why didn't you let the other chest guards up?" Nash asked suddenly. "We can only do this a few people at a time, sir." The supposed cop opened the gate and stepped cautiously onto the track. He started to walk forward, arms held out next to him like a tightrope walker. "I don't trust him," Gary told his father. Nash saw the real fear in his eyes. "He's a monster." "Gary, he has a badge," Nash replied. He watched the man from the corner of his eye as he approached. "Nash, right?" Ryan called. "Yeah." "Okay, Nash. You go first and be careful," Ryan said. "Then send your boy when you're safe." "Okay." Nash kissed his son firmly on his forehead and stepped out of the car. "No!" Gary wailed. He clutched weakly at his father's sleeve. "Sit down. I'm going to make sure everything's all right," Nash said. He pulled away from his son and planted both feet on either side of the track, following the cop's example. "Let me see your badge up close," Nash said to the newcomer. The man stopped only a few yards from Nash and nodded. He tore the badge out of his coat again and tossed it underhanded to Nash. Nash caught it, teetering a bit, but catching himself against the back of the car. Gary's hands caught him across the chest in a hug. They both examined the badge, which had the familiar county seal. It looked right to Nash, but Gary still shook his head in disapproval. Ryan and the others were finally able to see the officer by pushing themselves up with their legs to look over the tops of their seats. They had to use their peripherals, but were able to see any movements. "I love you, Gary," Nash said as he stepped forward beyond his son's reach. Nash came within arm's length of the other man, and the other cop held out a reassuring hand. Nash hesitated, swaying from the strong wind at such a height. "Daddy!" "Take it, sir. Take my hand," the man said. The trails of his scarf blew away from his neck in dancing flickers. Nash reached forward, but in one quick movement, the cop had smacked Nash's open hand away from him. This instantly threw Nash off balance and caused him to teeter. The man seemed to smile under his scarf, which rose up like swollen woolen lips. Then he grabbed Nash's arm with his other hand and pulled him all the way forward and off the track. Nash sounded off a high-pitched shriek as he sailed off the edge of the track and into the dead space beyond. Gary screamed and almost fell out of the car. "Oh my God!" Karen dug her fingernails into her chest guard's padding and hid her eyes. Ryan fell back in his seat, throat closing up like a drain. He watched from the corner of his eye as Nash plummeted to the gravel below, twisting and turning in the air, head over heels without end. Nash closed his eyes as tight as he could, yet his mouth relaxed each millisecond he was airborne. He knew his fate just as well as Ryan did, and just as well as any person in the car. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. He opened his eyes at the end and saw stars. Ryan shut his eyes before Nash hit the ground, but he couldn't escape the terrible crunch that followed. He heard Karen moan, Cody squeal, and Kyle scream, "Jesus Christ!" Gary was leaning halfway out of his seat, hand reaching into space after his fallen father. He screamed soundlessly, sucking back snot and tears. He had watched his father die. Nash could be seen at the bottom, half buried in gravel that rippled away from him as if he had upset the surface of a pond. His body was twisted in an odd angle, legs knotted together. Blood had already begun to seep through the dirt and rock, and a cloud of dust still surrounded the grisly scene. The man stood only yards from the car now, staring directly at Gary. "Run!" Karen screamed at him. Gary cried and scrambled forward in the car, slipping easily through the space between Kyle and Brock's seats. The man on the track slipped a hand into his jacket and pulled out a steel hook, much like the one hanging suspended from the Black Knight sculpture. A short metal cable was fastened to the end. The man began to swing it over his head in short, heavy sweeps, faster and faster until it was whistling in the air. He gave the cable slack with each swing and finally let it loose, crouching into it like a fisherman reeling in a trophy. The hook sailed over Brock's head just as Gary reached the front of the car. They all heard a wet crack, and blood squirted across Cody's hair. The hook had caught in Gary's forehead, at the exact spot his father had kissed him moments ago. The man on the track yanked on the steel cord, reeling Gary in. Gary fell backward in an unconscious faint, and Brock was able to catch Gary's sneaker in both of his hands. He rearranged his grip on the boy's ankle, and Gary screamed in pain. The boy was half in and out of the car, the man pulling with all his body strength and Brock pulling on his end. The hook dug deeper into Gary's skull, and he let out another cry of pain. "Let go!" Kyle yelled at Brock. "You gotta let him go, for God's sakes!" Brock made eye contact with Kyle and saw the fear in his face, something he'd never seen before. He also understood the truth in his friend's words. Slowly, Brock released his grip on his boy's ankle. He watched as Gary's kicking legs were dragged over the back of the car. The boy smacked against the track and continued to scream as he was pulled in. The man gave the cord one last yank before Gary was within arm's length. By then Gary was kicking lightly at the air, arms flailing limp at his side. The man grabbed the boy by his hair and dragged him toward the staircase. The man took his end of the cord and fed it through the wire gate a few times and tied a makeshift knot. Then he nudged the boy off the track with his boot. The boy fell, and Ryan heard him scream all the way to the bottom. Once the boy reached the maximum length of cable, it twanged like a struck cord, and Gary fell away from the hook. He struck the gravel some 20 feet from his father. The boy fell without the top half of his skull, which still clung to the bloody hook. The Black Knight. Chapter 3. Jeremy and Brock. Everyone turned away from the scene, eyes either shut tight or covered with sweaty palms. "No, no," Karen screamed. "This is my—" Karen was cut off by Jeremy's petrified scream. Ryan was about to turn and ask her what she was going to say, but they all heard the man's clanging footsteps as he descended the staircase. "You won't get away with this, you sick—" Kyle began, but Brock decided to finish his sentence. "You sick fuck!" Brock screamed into the sky. The man paused on the staircase, his bare fingers drumming on the railing. He turned into the blaring sun, his face masked in shadows behind his beanie cap and scarf. He simply bowed in front of them, his hands almost touching the ground, before proceeding across the gravel and back to the platform. He stepped over the dead body, faintly whistling. All persons in the car watched the man in the scarf climb back onto the platform and duck behind a set of gates. He casually opened the door to the nearby office and stepped inside. The door slammed behind him. The door he had just closed behind him was labeled, "Private Personnel Only." "How did this guy get into the park anyway?" Jeremy asked through his friend's retching sobs. No one could answer. 5 hours had passed, and the door marked private had not opened again. It was now close to 5:30, providing all occupants in the car enough time to collect themselves after Nash and his son's death. It wasn't so much like collecting their composure as it was completely shutting down. Stomachs growled, and Jeremy looked down upon the snack stand across the way with hungry eyes. Adding insult to injury, the sun was brutal. There were hardly a dozen clouds in the sky. Ryan's skin began to redden, and his tongue became as dry as his skin. Exhaustion began to set in. Kyle was praying furiously near the back, while Brock entertained himself by spitting over the edge and watching it plummet. Brock slicked back his black hair, trying to air out his sweat-stained tank top. "Good Lord, I'm starving," Brock blurted, hawking one last loogie over the side. "I would kill for a Two Gardens Park hot dog." "3 people just died and you're thinking about stuffing your fucking face," Jeremy remarked from directly in front of him. "Excuse me, kid, but a man has to eat," Brock replied gruffly. A bead of sweat trickled gallingly down his nose. "I'm hungry too," Cody announced, holding his belly. Ryan didn't know what to say. The only way anyone was going to get food was if they were rescued soon. His own stomach growled and then fell silent. "We've got to try and escape. Maybe we can fit under the chest guards," Jeremy called with renewed force. "You can try, but these guards are meant to keep us restrained," Ryan replied. "We'll both try. We're smaller," Cody said. "We might be able to." With that, Cody and Jeremy tried desperately to slip under their chest guards. First they slouched low in their seats, but they weren't able to get their chins past the stiff padding. Ryan recommended that the boys put their feet up on the seats in front of them. They did so and were able to free most of their bodies. Jeremy was able to free his chest, but his head was still too large to slip underneath the guard in his seat. He groaned with frustration and pain as he wrenched his head through. His sneaker kicked at Karen's seat, forcing her to lean forward into her own chest guard in order to avoid being nailed in the head. Then, with a whoop of glee, Jeremy slid free and clambered to his feet. He smoothed out his baggy sweatshirt as everyone else cheered joyously. "Jeremy, listen to me carefully," Ryan said, and Jeremy turned his full attention to the man sitting in front of him. "You have to edge your way up that track and down the staircase, just as the man did. Then, up on the platform, try to find a button that releases our chest guards on the control board. You see where the control panel is, right?" "Yes, sir," Jeremy replied, his eyes glued to the private door. "But what if he comes out?" "Don't worry. I think he fell asleep or something. We don't have time to debate whether this is the right moment. Now, hurry!" Ryan shouted. Jeremy nodded and gulped. He high-fived his friend Cody while following the aisle to the back of the car. Kyle patted the boy as he passed, and Brock slugged him softly on the arm. He was beaming. Jeremy stepped onto the track and began to climb toward the staircase on his hands and knees. He scurried up the gate and stepped onto the platform. With a deep breath, Jeremy darted down the stairs, long hair trailing behind him in yellow whips. No one saw the private door crack open. In that moment, the sun was just about to extinguish in the west, and a slight chill had swept over Two Gardens theme park before anyone knew any better. Jeremy reached the bottom of the stairs and tore across the gravel, feet crunching and kicking up dust. The boy passed Nash's corpse without a sideways glance and climbed onto the concrete platform. He inspected the closed door for a good 30 seconds before crossing the platform to reach the control panel. An overhead roof protected the platform, and Jeremy gratefully basked in the shade. Then Ryan watched the boy bend over the panel, hand hovering over a set of switches. A hand scratched absently at his scalp. Ryan tried to call down to him, but the boy was too far to hear. Jeremy then reached for a set of switches and all the passengers held their breaths. Suddenly, the door to the office burst open and the man in the scarf appeared, a rifle slung across his shoulder. He went eye level with the rifle's scope just as Jeremy turned to look. An echoing report resounded across the area, and Jeremy was thrown backward into the control panel. A red stain began to spread over his yellow sweatshirt, his mouth open and gurgling blood. The boy's eyes bulged outside his skull as his hands beat harshly upon the buttons and switches next to him. The man cocked the rifle with precise accuracy and set it against his shoulder again. Brock's chest guard suddenly heaved up from his body seconds after Jeremy struck the controls. Yet he only sat there for an extended moment, attention still drawn to the source of all the danger directly below him. Jeremy still slapped the buttons across his hips with open hands, which incited the gunman to squeeze the trigger again. Jeremy's head was driven backwards into the buttons, a red gaping hole replacing his left eye. There was a familiar hum as the Black Knight came back to life. Once again, a burst of cold, fierce wind struck Ryan and Karen in the face as the Black Knight descended the track toward the first upside-down loop. Ryan white-knuckled the handholds on either side of him, eyes blown dry in the wind. He tried to crane his neck to see what the gunman was doing, but it was no use. No one saw Jeremy die. The Black Knight car approached the crest of the loop with throttling speed. Brock saw this and tried to pull his guard back down across his chest, but it remained out of reach. He then tried to rebuckle his seatbelt, but was only able to find one end of the buckle. He realized that he had to be sitting on the other end. Brock gripped the side of the seat, muscles bulging and cords standing out in his neck. He screamed hoarsely as the car mounted the loop's upward arc, his own fate already decided. They rounded the loop and found themselves upside down, the G-force tugging at Brock's head, legs, chest, and arms. Gravity finally took hold of him and tore Brock from his seat with little resistance. With one last sharp cry, Brock slipped away from his car and seemed to disappear into the sky. Ryan didn't see him fall, but the car came to another jolting stop on the track, and this time they were stuck at an upward-sloping angle. Ryan could see the platform well from that angle, where the gunman was still fiddling with the blood-stained controls. The lifeless form of Jeremy lay at his feet. Once he was able to gather his wits and blink the tears from his eyes, he realized that Brock was gone. Ryan cocked his head to the left to see that Brock was lying face first in the gravel, some 100 feet from Nash's body. The gunman stood over the boy's body for a second or two before striding back to the office, rifle in hand. All men and women in the car watched the killer disappear into the office, leaving them alone once again. "No! No!" Cody cried, thrashing bitterly in his seat. His toes kicked the back of Ryan's seat. "No!" Ryan had begun to fall apart as well. His hands were limp at his side, his face fallen and shattered. Tears welled up in his eyes, and his lower lip trembled. "Just a kid," Ryan muttered. He stared uselessly down at his shaking hands. Then Karen said something to Ryan that he would never forget. "Ryan, when I go, promise me you won't watch me die," she sobbed. "Promise me you won't look at my broken body on the ground down there." "Karen?" Ryan asked. He stared deep into her eyes, but they seemed to retract away from him. "Promise me," she snapped. Her eyes searched his thoroughly. I promise," he replied. Ryan quickly averted eye contact with his girlfriend, mind racing. He then reassessed the graveyard below him and began to sob for the first time. Tears, long overdue, streaked down his cheeks. He cried for Mr. Stevens still hanging from the cursed statue marking their collective graveyard. He cried for the man who wasn't afraid as he fell, for the boy whose scalp hung from a hook like a terrible fishing lure, for the boy who had been shot on sight, and for the man who had literally held on for his life. Most of all, Ryan cried for his empty shell of a girlfriend, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than him. He cried to the heavens, cursing God for his mistake. He had let children die, and had little care for the women and children either. He fell asleep in this way, some time after the sun blinked away into night, dividing them from safety and from hope. The Black Knight. Chapter 4. Kyle and Cody. Ryan was lost in a clouded black void, turning and twisting inside a shifting tunnel that began to dip and descend like the roller coaster track. Somewhere Karen was screaming, and a man replied, quite calmly. She screamed for the man to leave her alone. The man's voice said, "If he doesn't know, he must be informed." Ryan shook himself awake to see Karen sleeping next to him, her head resting on the chest guard. It was quite cool outside, a soft breeze blowing past their car in the sky. Ryan glanced at his watch and saw that it was 7:45. The control platform was empty besides the boy's dead body. The pool of blood around him had grown and had begun to dry. Jeremy's bug eyes remained open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The door marked private was still closed. "Ryan, are you awake?" Cody asked from right behind Ryan. "Yeah, kid, what's up?" Ryan offered with a slow yawn. His stomach churned hungrily, and he braced himself against the raging cramps running up his abdomen. "I can't sleep is all," Cody replied quietly. "Who could blame you? I guess I just got lucky." "I got something on my mind, Ryan. I've seen this guy before." "What do you mean, kid?" Ryan asked after a confused pause. "I think I saw this guy before in the arts park by my house," Cody explained. "I was there skateboarding, skating with Jeremy, and this guy strolled up." "You sure it was him?" Ryan asked. Karen started to look around, dazed and interested. Her ears perked as the boy continued his story. "I'm pretty sure it was him. He had the same yellow scarf on, but hanging loose on his shoulders and not wrapped around his neck," Cody said. "I remember he looked really odd, wearing such wintry clothes in spring. He had the same coat, but different pants. I can remember he had long sideburns and green eyes." "How long ago did you see him?" Ryan asked. "Spring last year," Cody said simply. "Maybe early April." "What was he doing?" "Looking around at the sculptures mostly. I kinda watched him as I walked around. He then met a woman and—" Cody fell silent. "What?" Kyle asked from behind Cody. "He met a woman who looks a lot like the girl you're with," Cody said, dumbfounded. Ryan didn't have to turn to know that the boy was wide-eyed with this new realization. Ryan turned toward Karen, who gave him a small smile. Her eyes blinked heavily, and her face was sleek with pouring sweat. "I don't know what you're talking about," Karen replied, avoiding eye contact with her boyfriend. "This kid is obviously making stuff up." "It probably wasn't her," Cody countered. "It was a long time ago." "What were they doing?" Ryan asked, still studying Karen's face. "They looked like they were struggling, and the woman was crying." Karen winced. Ryan was about to question Cody further when a gunshot echoed over the silent park. Everyone in the car turned toward the dimly lit platform where the gunman currently stood, his rifle pointed straight up into the black sky. He waved with one gloved hand as the fluorescent bulb above his head flickered, giving him the illusion of appearing and disappearing. When the light finally caught, the killer rested the rifle on his shoulder and pointed the nose straight up at the car. He lowered his face to the scope, his other hand going for the trigger. "Shit! Duck!" Ryan screamed, slouching as far as he could in his seat. "Oh God!" Kyle announced from the back, and then Cody shrieked in terror. Karen screamed, pressing her face into Ryan's shoulder. Another shot rang out, and Ryan heard the bullet pound the metal car. He could also hear the distant sound of a gun cocking before another bullet struck the car. A loud ring followed as the shot ricocheted into the night. "No! Oh God, no!" Kyle cried. The gun exploded again, and Ryan heard the whine of a bullet just a few seats behind him. Karen shrieked once more before another heavy gun blast smashed against her eardrums. A louder sound, much closer, resembled the dull smack of stomping a dead leaf on the sidewalk. This time Kyle screamed in unmistakable pain. Everyone knew that Kyle was hit. Ryan happened to peek over the edge to see the gunman leaning his hot rifle against the control panel. He gave them one last glance before turning back into his office and shutting the door. Kyle sounded another scream. "Oh Jesus, my chest! He got me in the ribs!" Kyle gasped through what sounded like a mouthful of gravel and water. "Jesus Christ!" "Where'd it hit you, Kyle?" "Where in the chest?" Ryan blurted, trying to keep his voice calm. "Oh God, I'm bleeding pretty bad," Kyle replied shakily. "Left side. Jesus, hurts like a bitch." "How bad are you bleeding?" Ryan sent Karen a sideways glance. Her fingers were clamped between her teeth, eyes shut and pouring tears. I, enough to pool around my lap," Kyle replied weakly. "Damn it," Ryan cursed under his breath. "Don't worry," Cody suddenly shouted. Then Karen was thrust forward as Cody's feet pressed up against the back of her seat. Cody wrenched his upper body through the chest guard until his chin rested on the cold padding. He sounded a tremendous groan, squeezing his head through the tight space. Then he kicked at Karen's back as Cody popped the rest of his cranium beyond the chest guard. After that, he pulled himself back to his feet and instinctively went to stretch his muscles. "Cody, please get help," Kyle cried. Cody turned toward Kyle, nodding slightly and eyeing the man's open wound. Ryan peered down the track at the second set of stairs that he had observed before. It was much closer than the other staircase, which was only a few yards away. Cody must have spotted it before Ryan because he was already passing through the aisle to climb over the nose of the car. Ryan got his first good look at the kid as he passed. Cody was sweating profusely, and dark bags weighed heavy underneath his eyes. He was trembling immensely as he stepped lightly onto the track, but he still managed to send Ryan one last feverish and empty look as he set his sights for the platform below them. "Careful, kid," Ryan advised solidly. "You've got this. It is possible." The boy sat down on his butt and slowly inched his way down the sloping track. He made quick time with this strategy and had opened the gate to the stairs in no time. He turned, gave Ryan a distracted thumbs up, and then mounted his first step. In a matter of minutes, he was on the ground level, sprinting across the choppy gravel. It was so dark that Ryan lost the boy for a second in the night. But suddenly Cody was illuminated in the heavy glow of the control pad's overhead light. "Yeah, kid, that's it," Ryan murmured under his breath. Kyle moaned painfully and muttered a series of incomprehensible words. Cody ran for the controls at the far end of the platform, leaping over the track with ease. He paused at the rifle leaning against the controls, visibly deciding on whether to pick it up. Yet he turned away from the gun and stared down at the console. He then performed the same confused head scratch that Jeremy had used before he died. Cody's head continued to swivel over his shoulder to check on the closed office door. Unfortunately, his eyes were drawn to his friend's dead body at his feet. Ryan could tell that Cody's hands were trembling considerably more, even at his height and distance. Then, as expected, the office door creaked open. "No!" Karen shouted. "Look out!" Yet Cody was already aware of his visitor. The door swung open just as Cody wrapped his sweaty fingers around the rifle barrel. He stepped back with the gun stock pressed up against his shoulder in an instant, just as he had witnessed the gunman do. One finger went for the trigger and one eye zoomed into the scope. The gunman stepped out of the office, holding what looked like a set of throwing stars. His masked head swerved from left to right, and when he noticed Cody at the controls, he jolted backward, and his hand wound back with the throwing stars sliding between his fingers. But Cody had already pulled the trigger. From above them, Ryan held his breath, and Kyle moaned. The gun bucked out of Cody's hands with the shot, and the glass piece from the scope connected with his forehead and split it open with a rush of blood. The gun fell to the platform with a crash, and the butt end crunched with Cody's toes. The gunman was swept backward as the bullet turned his kneecap into a dripping red crater. The hand holding the shuriken stars flashed with a sudden flick of the wrist, and all 3 stars fanned out into the air. Then the gunman collapsed onto the platform, crying out in bitter pain. One star buried itself in the platform steel floor, and another disappeared into the sky. The last one cut across Cody's forearm, tearing open a deep laceration just below his elbow. Cody folded to his knees, screaming while the gunman clambered toward his rifle. Yet Cody noticed this and smacked the gun away with the back of his hand. It skated across the platform, well beyond both of their reaches. As a recourse, the killer grabbed Cody's wounded arm and they both crumpled to the cold steel, 2 hulks in the flickering light. They both wrestled across the ground, the gunman's hands grappling for Cody's neck. Cody's hands beat at the man's chest, and one flailing finger was able to pull the beanie cap over his eyes. The gunman automatically loosened his grip on Cody's neck as one of his hands hurried to free his eyes. Cody saw his chance and mustered all his strength to thrust the killer off his chest with his knees and hands. As the man rolled across the platform, Cody grimaced as the wound on his arm opened even wider. Once again, the killer wound up on his chest and tried to regain his footing. Cody was able to pounce on his back and send him sprawling again. Cody seized the man's cap and yanked his head backward, exposing his throat. Then Cody smashed the killer's nose into the floor. Even from his lookout point, Ryan could hear the gunman's screams. Cody pulled on the cap again, which slipped off the man's head and revealed a thick tangle of black hair. Cody discarded the man's hat and again pushed the killer's face into the steel. He did it once more until the man's body stopped squirming and his eyes had diminished. Cody fell off the man and leaned against the nearest wall, trying to regain his breath. Just as he attempted to stand up to return to the controls, a booted foot cracked him across the jaw. Faster than any of them expected, the gunman had rolled over onto his back and sent a sharp kick in Cody's direction, which leveled him with the ground in a daze. The man crawled toward Cody's body and grabbed him by the ankle. The boy cried out, scrambling away as sharp nails dug into Cody's bare ankle. Just like that, the killer reeled him in, and he was laughing. The gunman was just about to wrap both of his hands around Cody's leg, but the boy finally kicked at the killer's already dislocated nose with the heel of his shoe. Another sickening crack echoed in the small space, and the man screamed again. Cody wriggled away from his grasp just as blood cascaded down the man's face and scarf. With a new surge of strength, Cody managed to stand up and run to the other side of the platform and away from the controls. "What is he doing? Why isn't he going for the controls?" Ryan cried out. "He's leaving us," Karen said with a distant voice. "We're dead." Ryan watched the boy reach the set of cubbies where they had all stashed their personal belongings, including their cell phones and change, right before boarding the Black Knight. Cody reached into the cubbyhole and withdrew his cell phone. From behind him, the gunman had regained a set of wobbly feet, nursing his nose and shattered kneecap with his left and right hand, respectively. He tried to apply weight to his left leg, but it collapsed under him and he fell on his side with a sharp yelp. Then the gunman noticed the rifle lying within his reach. He snatched it up quickly and flipped onto his stomach with the gun draped over his shoulder and back. Like a sniper on a hill, he cocked the weapon and aimed it directly at Cody's back. "Watch out!" Ryan screamed from the coaster. Cody heard this and turned swiftly around, just in time to stare into the man's rifle. The gunman laughed maliciously under his blood-stained scarf. Cody only had time to squint his eyes before the killer pulled the trigger. "No!" Ryan yelled. There was only a soft click, indicating an empty stock. Cody smiled, pocketing the cell phone, and then hopped off the platform. Ryan and Karen watched with frozen awe as he sprinted into the night and became lost in the shadows. They watched the boy blink out of existence and then exchange silent smiles. They didn't want to laugh and cry out while Kyle sat behind them, moaning in unrelenting pain, so they reached across the seat and held hands instead. From below, the killer roared with rage. The Black Knight. Part 5. Ryan and Karen. The gunman lay there on the cold steel for the longest time, his long black hair hanging over his face. The light above him flickered, allowing him to appear and disappear from the darkness. Then he simply crawled back to his office and pulled his way back in. Ryan watched him curl his legs out of the way of the door before it swung slowly closed behind him. He had left a trail of his own blood and red handprints on the private door. Kyle? Kyle, are you still hanging in there, man? Ryan asked. No answer. Come on, try to say something, Ryan begged. Give me a cough. Still silence. Give me something. Somewhere a team of crickets commenced their chirping, and Ryan listened to them for the first time. This whole thing is so fucked, Karen spat. You're telling me, Karen, Ryan snapped. And I'm going to need some answers from you, not later. Karen withdrew as if slapped. What do you mean? She asked shakily. You and this psychopath have met before, Ryan told his girlfriend. Want some answers? That's some misunderstanding, Ryan. You... Now! She swallowed her saliva and then sighed, still avoiding his eyes. I was at the wrong place at the wrong time. What do you mean? I found out that he was planning to kill someone in my office, Karen said with much difficulty. And he knew I knew. Oh my God, Karen, Ryan said. He found me in the park and threatened me. I was horrified. Karen burst into fresh tears. He was afraid I'd call the cops. Why didn't you tell anyone? Ryan asked. Why didn't you tell me? It was too dangerous. He knew everything about me. And all that you... About me? I didn't tell anyone, and now he's killing for no reason, Karen blurted. It's all my fault. Who is this guy? Ryan asked. Rolled something, she replied. Some hired man. I just can't even get into all of it. How did you know? What do you mean? How did you find out about this hit? Ryan elaborated. She turned her head away from him. I really don't want to talk about this. Karen, you have to talk to me, all right? This is important. I'm tired. I'm starving. I'm dead inside, Ryan, she said. Ryan had the sneaking suspicion that something wasn't right here. She wasn't telling the whole truth, and he was just about to press her further when he heard a crash off in the distance. They both turned to focus on the locked iron gate to the park, which was the only way in and out. They could faintly see a speck in a green tank top haul itself onto the very top of the gate. Cody! Ryan blurted, excitedly. Slowly but surely, Cody found a way to climb down just enough so that the drop to the ground only ended in a twisted ankle, which he quickly put to use. Just like that, Cody was on the other side of 2 gardens, finally outside. He didn't look back as he sprinted down the hill and out of sight. Karen, Ryan turned toward her, but she had her head directed the other way, her eyes closed. Ryan knew that she was faking sleep, but also knew that he was not getting anything else out of her. Godspeed, Cody, Ryan muttered as his own eyes drooped with exhaustion. The world blurred and then died. In minutes Ryan had fallen asleep, his stomach growling unnoticed. From below on the platform, the office door swung open. A scuffling echo followed the hollow sound of wheels on wood. From the depths of the room came the gunman sitting on a desk chair with 4 wheels. He spun around in his chair so that his back was facing the platform. His left foot pushed the chair beyond his office doorway, while his right leg hung limp. He had stripped off his scarf and wrapped it around the bullet wound in his knee. His hat was pulled back down over his face, barely obscuring 2 cold and hateful eyes. Most of the blood had been wiped clean from his lower face, but his nose hung crooked and had swelled a dark purple. Dried blood caked his chin. He navigated back to the control panel by looking over his shoulder as he pushed the chair in reverse. He spun back around when he reached the controls, placing his trembling palms on the board. He smiled faintly, selecting the correct switch. He reached for it, eyes glinting madly. He knew that he had to act fast. The boy had most certainly already contacted the police on his cell phone, and there was so much left to be done. Then he grinned, leaning forward in the swivel chair. His fingers wrapped around the switch, and he lifted his head to watch the action above. He loved action. A dull screeching whine tore Ryan and Karen from their sleep. Their seats vibrated as the car shifted forward and began to roll smoothly on its natural momentum. Realization slapped Ryan across his face, forcing him to look at the platform. Yet he didn't have to look because the manic laughter already told him the man had returned. "Oh, no!" Again they were flying down their track and then rocketing through a pair of barrel rolls that bounced their heads against their guards most unforgivingly. The man on the platform rocked with laughter, fingers ready on the controls while his eyes watched the toy car in the sky with eager anticipation. He knew when to stop the car, but it was all about timing. He would have to get it just right. He could see the last upside-down loop set out on the landscape like a waiting noose, ready to catch its last two participants. His fingers grazed the switch, ready to pull. Just as the car ascended the loop, he began counting down under his breath. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He flicked the switch just as the car became parallel with the ground below, completely upside down. It came to a stop with a rattling jolt, and Ryan and Karen's heads were thrust forward and then back into the hard padding. There was a second of weightlessness before Ryan caught up with gravity and fell toward the earth and into the chest guard, hair hanging, blood rushing, and his shoulder screaming with pain. Yet Karen screamed louder. A feeling of helplessness and pressure built up inside Ryan along with the increase of blood in his head. Karen sobbed and gagged dryly next to Ryan, bile dripping freely from her mouth, which then trailed up her nose and forehead and into her hair. It was a terrible feeling as Ryan's entire body locked up from the strain, his eyes seeming to pop out of his head with the immense pressure. A massive weight in his head threatened to drag his entire body through his chest guard. His upper body trembled, the bones and muscles in the shoulders ready to give in. Gravity pulled at him relentlessly, trying to reunite him with the ground. Karen moaned as tears dripped rapidly from her strands of hair. Ryan could see that her face had changed to a bright scarlet, all the veins popping out in her forehead. He knew that he looked just as bad, maybe even worse. A loud metallic pop issued from behind them, and as they prepared for something horrible to happen, they soon watched Kyle's dead body fall into view and flip head over heels into the track below them with a tremendous crash that resembled the ring of a bell. From there he bounced and spun toward the ground, where he came to rest in the gravel pit amidst a screen of dust. Ryan's vision began to blur, stars exploding before him like firecrackers. Right when he thought his head would pop, he heard the voice of their captor, magnified through a megaphone speaker. "Are we having fun yet?" the voice called. "How are you hanging up there? We'll have to talk fast, though, if that's all right." Karen screamed next to Ryan, but it was faint and defeated. She was close to passing out. "Have you told him, Karen?" the killer asked from below. This question echoed through the ghost town of a park like a disembodied voice in an empty house. Karen looked at Ryan with a purple face and watery eyes tinted pink. "Have you told him why I'm here?" "Karen?" Ryan managed. She closed her eyes, her blue lips trembling. When she opened her eyelids again, she said, "I killed us all." "They all died for you, Karen, all of them." The man with the megaphone was much angrier now, his voice rising to a loud buzz that crackled with Ryan's eardrums. He saw me, Ryan. I didn't see him," Karen said, arms hanging limply next to her face. "I don't want anything you have, Karen," the megaphone announced. "This is a different kind of blackmail. You see, Ryan, she challenged me after I refused to help her, and it was quite an insult to a contractor like me, who has a 100% success rate. I offered to help in any other way, but I just couldn't kill her boss. Her boss had already hired me to kill off a few of his business competitors. Mr. Seasons just so happened to be on this exclusive list he gave me, and when I heard about this new ride that Seasons was opening, including his little contest, I knew this would be the best way to kill multiple birds with one stone, so to speak." "What's he talking about?" Ryan hissed, but Karen could only close her eyes and spurt even more tears. "But you might be happy to know, Karen, that the man who just fell to the ground was Kyle, your boss's first cousin. I know it's not who you wanted, but that was his family. Of course, your boss did want him dead, but we can still pretend like you're a winner here. We're both winners. It was a shame that Kyle's roommate had to die as well, but that's just how this contest was set up. I can't go against the rules. Nash's son didn't have to die either, but Nash certainly did. Nash was a politician, so I believe it would be accurate to say that this was all politics. The new trade regulations that Nash was single-handedly responsible for enforcing will now certainly be abandoned, and thus ensure that your boss can reap more benefits with his overseas partners. The boys, well, they saw us that day in the park when we met. I know you remember that day. That's when we both made a deal, and, unfortunately, you reneged on your side of the bargain and insulted me. Since we didn't make a deal that day, just like the boys, you're a liability, and I can't have that. So I fixed the drawing of your names as well as this entire day, and I did it for you, Karen. I needed to show you that I finish what I start, and if there's anything left undone, well, you know the rest. I'm so sorry, Karen said to Ryan, even quieter than before. This is all my fault. The feeling of vulnerability was too overwhelming for Ryan. He knew that one push of a button could send him falling to his death. Although he couldn't see the man in the stocking cap, he knew that he was close to the controls and had memorized them well enough to act in the dark. Ryan tried to raise his hands to buckle his lap belt, but he found that he had no strength. The stars began to dim above his head, the moon a bright blur in the sky. He was already dead and could no longer see the difference between sleeping and waking. If this was to be his last minute, he was going to make it meaningful. Karen, he said softly. Her closed eyelids twitched, and she muttered something underneath her breath. I don't care what you did. I love you. I don't care. She smiled and cracked open her red eyes to find Ryan one last time. Although his face was scarlet and pulsing sickly like a beating heart, he was everything that she cared for and cared to remember. He was Ryan, the man she had tried to protect from the monster below, but she had failed. She thought that she had rid herself of this man, but he had found her at last. And worst of all, he didn't intend to punish her, but also the man she loved most. Ryan smiled back at her weakly and then closed his eyes. It's time for business. It's time for the final act, the man declared into the megaphone. Time for the encore. Everything is curtains. They then heard a rattling hum, but they were still in their seats. The car began to roll again, now on the final stretch. It was the final run of the coaster, a straight, level line leading back to the platform where all passengers could exit the car. Through his squinting eyes, Ryan could barely make out the man's silhouette in the flickering light. Karen groaned when she saw him, wanting to cover her eyes and hide her face, if only she had the strength to raise her arms. Nor could Ryan muster the courage or energy to do or say anything. All he could do was sit in his plastic seat as the prisoner that he was. The car came to a final stop on the platform, their chest guards flying up like taut slingshots. All they could do was sit there dumbly, dubious to the fact that they were actually free. Ryan put his hands to his heart, refusing to believe that he could feel it beating. He had been able to do that for so long, not with the chest guard, but now he wondered if he'd really been alive at all up there. Don't even think about it, the man said. The rifle now rested idly on his shoulder. He rolled over to the car on the chair, reaching out for Karen with one of his blood-stained hands. He wore a crooked grin with eyes that gleamed like fire. Karen shrank away from him, leaning into Ryan. Don't think about getting up, my friends. Stay away from me, Karen screeched, clutching her boyfriend's chest. The man stopped as if slapped, and then he rolled his chair back to the controls. He crossed his arms, the rifle placed over his lap neatly. Nice to meet you, Ryan. My name is Rolled Black, the man said. He didn't wait for Ryan to respond before continuing. So, Karen, have you thought any more about what I said? What about our deal? I'm still willing to humor you. You said that you'd kill me if given the chance. Well, is that what you still want? I don't see a better opportunity than now. I'm crippled, and that's a great disadvantage. Granted, I have the gun, but you two have the numbers. I would have to pick one of you to shoot first. The other would most likely escape, and perhaps if we both agreed on who I shot, then we could make a deal right now. Who would like to leave, and who would like to sacrifice him or herself for the other? Karen only watched him silently, and then chuckled. This caused the man to frown. I'm sorry? Rold asked. I thought about what you said, Karen replied, and I have an answer for you. Then begin, Rold said with a smile, folding his arms. Karen turned toward Ryan and addressed him directly. My boss is a terrible man, Ryan. The kind of man that sent chills up my spine when I was just starting out in the company, Karen began. She swallowed hard and ignored the killer's impatient clearing of his throat. I never told you this, but he was abusive for the first few years I worked for him. But once I was transferred to the other office, he pretty much left me alone. I still wanted to kill him, though. He was my boss, Mr. Carrington, if you remember. Mr. Carrington. God, Karen, Ryan said with a sharper edge to his voice. I do remember him. What did he do? He never hurt me, but he invaded my space more than a few times, and he would make inappropriate calls to my cell phone in our house. He once followed me to my car after work and made a pass at me, but another co-worker walked by, so he slinked off. Ryan curled his lips over his teeth to hide his gritting snarl. I should have alerted the police, but I knew that once I became my own boss, I wouldn't have to worry about him anymore. Karen hung her head so that her hair hid her face. Then Mr. Carrington hired another assistant, as I should have suspected, and I watched the abuse begin all over again with an innocent girl like me, whom I watched develop from an innocent young woman with all the drive and motivation that I once had to a paranoid woman who could no longer trust her closest friends in the office. I wanted him dead, she continued. I wanted him out of my life and so far gone that he would never take advantage of another young woman again. I had this idea to take over one of his assistant's many chores for the day, which was to walk his terrier through the local arts park during my lunch break. I would take the blame for everything, and probably get fired, but that day I didn't care anymore. Back when I was his assistant, I had this fantasy of letting go of his dog's leash right at the edge of the busy intersection outside our office, and then watching the cars pound him into tar on the asphalt. I never went through with it, but this day I was willing. I even got as far as the sidewalk, the dog already pulling taut on the leash, ready to jump into the street and far away from me. I know, I would never do it. I know that I would only hurt myself torturing an animal like that. And even though that dog was a brat, it wasn't the dog's fault that his master was such a piece of shit. I would have been worth it to see the look on his face when he learned that this damn dog was dead. But my job would be over, and I could see him pressing charges for kidnapping his dog or something close. Yes, I wouldn't put it past him either. But let's not make this personal, Karen, Rold cut in. Let's bring me into this story and speed this along. She's just about to get to the good part. Just as I was letting go of the leash, this man ran across the soccer field behind me, whistling for the dog and even calling it by name, Karen continued. The dog jumped up on this man and even licked his hand, but I never saw his face. He was always wearing that scarf, so I knew this guy was not there by coincidence. He had been watching me, and most likely knew that someone walked the dog through the park around the same time every day. I was there scouting for the dog, Rold interjected, but I suspected your boss's assistant to be holding the leash that day. She was on his list, of course, of people he wanted taken care of. Apparently he was having an affair with her, and she was threatening to go to his wife. I was there to get a good look at her and maybe even take care of her there, in the park, if I found an opportunity. Yet I wouldn't kill her that day or any day for that matter. Once I told your boss that you were holding the leash that day, your name quickly jumped to the top of the list. Even though that's the main reason why you're here, we both have much larger loose ends to tie up, if you don't mind. He called me out on it right away, Karen continued, avoiding the man's eyes but looking at Ryan for strength. He knew that I meant to kill the dog, and he actually got a kick out of it. He told me that he liked my spirit, and that he was once like me, hoping to hurt someone else by hurting someone he or she loved. But then he claimed that hurting loved ones doesn't bring about as much satisfaction as someone might think. As he told me, you have to start at the source. If someone does you wrong, an eye for an eye really doesn't cut it. He told me that he lived by the philosophy of an eye for a head. This was a poor choice of words, I admit, Rold said with a chuckle. If I had known what kind of woman I was dealing with, Ryan, I would have held my tongue. It was as if she knew what I was without me ever saying it. Maybe it's because the killer in you recognized the killer in me. The two of us recognized each other. And who could blame you for enlisting the aid of your fellow elder? As soon as I spoke those words, she demanded that I kill her boss for her. I told her that I couldn't do it, as I already had a deal with the man, but I said I would kill anyone else, just give me a name. I liked her, and I felt bad for giving her such spectacular advice without being able to live up to my own words. Some things were said after that, and she basically told me that I was a coward, and that if I was my own man, I wouldn't have to follow some code I'd invented. Thus, I should be able to kill whoever I wanted. She made a huge scene that attracted the attention of other onlookers, including the boys, Jeremy and Cody. They got a good look at me and were scared enough to hightail it out of there. It really was unfortunate that it had to end this way. I wanted to do right by you, Karen, and I tried to speak to your reason. But you stormed off with that dog, and I haven't seen you until now. I know that it's not fair that I have to kill you instead of him, just because he got to me first. If only you had found me in enough time, the situation would be completely reversed. He would be the one dying, perhaps under different circumstances, but there's no use drumming up the past or worrying about potential futures. These are the people we chose to be, and we have to live with the choices we've made. So, this was all to feed some sick fantasy in your fucked up head? Ryan broke in, quickly regaining his feet. You killed all those innocent people, one by one in front of us, to prove some point to her and me? Did you think I'd hate her after hearing that story? After all we've been through? You thought I would compare her to someone like you? I think I understand you. And I see how much of a child you are. Was this all about hurt feelings? No one's ever stood up to you before. Well, add me to your little list. Even if this is the last time I stand, it's against you. Rold pointed his weapon at Ryan, just as he was about to step out of the car. Take a seat, Ryan, if you don't mind. Rold's voice had been so hot that Ryan plopped back down in his seat, eyeing the gun warily. You're wrong. She's better than you, Ryan said. Karen turned toward him, her eyes swimming and a smile creeping over her face. Rold leaned in close to his rifle. Would you take a bullet for her? He lined the crosshairs with Karen's forehead, who yelped and tried to duck in her seat. Would you die for a murderer, Ryan? No, Ryan said. Rold stopped, lowering the rifle slightly. Even in the darkness, Ryan could see that his face was blank. You want me to die, and I won't die for a murderer like you, Ryan answered. At that, Ryan bounded from his seat. He leapt over Karen and landed with one foot on the platform next to the killer. He pounced on the man just as the gun went off. The Black Knight. Chapter 6. Rold Black and the Black Knight. Ryan fell on top of Rold Black, sending them both flying backward across the platform on the chair's four wheels. The rifle went off, once and then twice, and drowned out Karen's high-pitched screams. Both bullets missed Ryan as his hands grappled for the rifle's muzzle. The chair rebounded off the wall and sent them both onto the steel floor. Black screamed, Ryan wrenching the weapon from his hands. Ryan knew exactly where to go after he had the gun in his arms. He drove the butt end into Rold's wounded leg, the crunch of the killer's knee all too real in Ryan's ears. Black squealed, throwing a punch into Ryan's jaw. Ryan fell off him with a spinning head and glazed eyes. Rold threw a kick with his good leg and planted his toe into Ryan's breast. Then Rold crawled backward as Ryan lay on the ground fighting for his air. The rifle was forgotten by his side, but Rold wasn't reaching for it. He was listening as the front gates of the Two Gardens amusement park swung open with a prolonged squeak. Rold turned to crawl off the platform and found Cody standing in his way, wearing a determined scowl. On his hands and knees, Rold peered up at the kid, who was now much taller than him. He attempted a smile, but the gesture did little to prevent Cody from kicking him directly in the face, so that blood spurted like hose water onto the floor. The killer's scream was muffled as Cody kicked again, this time in the ribs. Rold curled into the fetal position, coughing up red and glaring at Cody with defeated eyes. From behind him came the click of a rifle as it cocked. He turned his blood-streaked face into the line of the rifle's sight, and he laughed when he saw that Karen's finger was on the trigger. A long silence followed that was filled with Ryan's gasping breath. Then Rold began to laugh harder, and the excess blood in his throat gargled with each distended breath. Karen continued to stand there, the gun trembling in her hands. Here. Karen turned to look at Cody, now standing at her side. He held his hands out for the gun, and the grave expression on the young boy's face told Karen that he had to be the one to do it. She wanted to tell the kid that it was over, and that they didn't have to kill him. The police were there and could take him away forever, but a part of her knew that some things had to be dealt with, the source, and in the right moment. There was no use for delay when dealing with this kind of monster. An eye for a head, as someone had once told her. Karen nodded and handed Cody the rifle. Rold stopped laughing at once and growled at the child like an animal. Cody centered the gun against his shoulder, lined up the sight, and pulled the trigger. The killer's head was thrown back into the floor, a giant crater in his forehead. With lightning speed, the boy pulled back the hammer, lined up again, and sent a new bullet into the killer's neck. The boy set himself up with the third shot and blew another hole into Rold's chest. He went for a fourth and fifth, and just when Karen thought there were no more bullets in the gun, Cody fired a sixth time. He then tossed the rifle onto the smoking body. I made the call to the cops, but I just couldn't leave, Cody told Karen, tears filling his face. I had to come back. I'm glad I did. 6 bullets for the 6 lives he took. Karen looked at Cody as his entire frame shook and his knees gave out from under him. She caught him around the arms and allowed him to clutch at her sleeves and bury his face in her stomach. At that moment, she knew that Cody could not take credit for killing Rolled Black. One look at the body was enough to raise enough questions. It didn't seem fair to show the world what a monster like Rolled Black could do to a child like Cody. It seemed easier to tell the police that she had put the killer down and had emptied the gun to do it. It seemed better that way. With that story, the kid could continue being just that, and she could be the responsible adult who had killed for self-preservation. She would become the killer if she needed to be. After what she had done to the other poor people who had died at the hands of Rold, she already considered herself a murderer. It was just a matter of wearing the title now, and she was ready to be the world's hero, if need be. God knows that she didn't deserve it, and would have much rather had Ryan or Cody take the credit for saving the day, but she also suspected that she was saving them from the carnivorous feeding force of the media spotlight. If she wasn't strong, it would surely chew her up and spit out her bones in a way she challenged it. Yet after what she faced, the only thing that she really feared was death, and even that seemed like an old friend now, perched there on her shoulder and just out of sight. Along with the onslaught of police officers rushing onto the scene, flashlights spotting their vision, hands took theirs, and men's voices pulled them out of the darkness. Flashlights weren't enough to kill all the shadows, but they helped. Even in all the commotion, Ryan found Karen, and they were able to cling to each other for a moment, before they were torn apart again and escorted into the open doors of a waiting ambulance.